On this Labor Day, the battle over workers' freedoms are at a crossroads. Though union officials and their allies in government use this day to claim to speak for America's workers, they are simultaneously hard at work trying to undermine the individual liberty of those same American workers. The last decade saw record advances for workers' right to free association, with 5 new states enacting right-to-work protections which defend a worker from being fired merely for refusal to pay dues to a labor union he or she does not support. 27 states now protect this basic fundamental freedom, and as of last year, a majority of America's working men and women now work in right-to-work states. That's on top of the National Right to Work Foundation won 2018 Janus Supreme Court victory, which recognized the First Amendment right of every public worker to choose for him or herself whether or not to fund a labor union. Unfortunately, rather than embrace voluntarism and worker choice, union officials have instead doubled down on coercion. Their top priority in Congress, the so-called PRO Act, would add tens of millions of workers to the union boss's pay up or be fired ranks by wiping out all state right-to-work laws by federal fiat. Meanwhile, despite the Janus ruling, government union bosses have continued to undermine and outright ignore the First Amendment right of public employees to cease all funding of the political activities of all government unions. This has resulted in dozens of Janus enforcement lawsuits nationwide, including 2 foundation cases currently pending at the United States Supreme Court. Yet big labor's push for more power to impose their so-called representation and mandatory dues payments on workers remains at odds with the overwhelming majority of Americans. Polls show Americans still overwhelmingly oppose forced unionism, consistently finding that around 80% of Americans agree with the right-to-work principle that union membership and dues payment should be voluntary, not coerced. On this Labor Day, as hard-working rank-and-file workers continue to grapple with economic uncertainty and lingering COVID disruptions, it is more important now than ever that we reject big labor's scheme to expand forced unionism over more workers and instead respect the individual freedom to decide whether or not a union deserves their support.
Amid the Labor Day holiday, the Right to Work Foundation is sounding the alarm over Biden's proposal to change labor laws. One America's John Hines has that report.
The National Right to Work Foundation is a grassroots lobbying organization standing for the idea that all Americans must have the right to join a union if they so choose, but that no one should ever be forced to affiliate with a union to get or keep a job. And with us is Mark Mix, the president of the National Right to Work Foundation. And Mr. Mix, I believe that Jennifer Abruzzo is the new attorney for the National Labor Relations Board, and she has put out a memo in which she has outlined a plan to roll back the clock in what has been called the most dramatic changes to labor law in the last 40 years with this Biden administration. What seems to be going on, Mark Mix?
Well, it's a big story, and there's lots of big stories in the news today, but there's always this constant drumbeat of compulsion that comes out of the National Labor Relations Board. This is the 5-member board that was created back in the 1930s to basically adjudicate labor policy when the federal government decided to take over labor policy for the entire nation. They created a 3-member board, and of course everything in Washington grows, so it went from 3 to 5 members. And Jennifer Abruzzo is the general counsel of the National Labor Relations Board. 23 minutes into the Biden administration, as the echoes of Garth Brooks' Amazing Grace were coming back to the podium, Biden requested that the general counsel, the general counsel that had 11 months left on their term, be fired. Either that or resign. The general counsel said, this is an independent agency, we shouldn't resign. You're tampering with something that's never been done before in the history of the NLRB. But Biden said either resign or be fired by 5 o'clock. And the general counsel said, I'm not going to resign, so he was fired at 5 o'clock. The next next day, the acting general counsel, who moved up one step, was given the same email saying resign or be fired. And at 5 o'clock that day, the day after the inauguration, that general counsel was fired. And so the president has put in an activist, Jennifer Abruzzo, who was a former general counsel.
She's replacing these people.
Right. She's the new general counsel. She's the former attorney, lead attorney for the Communication Workers of America, which is a very large union. And she now is in charge of the litigation process at the National Labor Relations Board. And John, you correctly identified, she put out a memo saying that she wanted to change things, and it really affects the National Right to Work Foundation because several of the issues that she is raising, saying she no longer wants anyone to deal with except her here in Washington, are issues that our Legal Defense Foundation is representing.
Now, she's changing the way, or the rules, I guess, with regard to whether or not you need to vote to join a union or whether or not you need to just simply check off a card. What's going on there?
Yeah, absolutely. Card check is one of the highest priorities of organized labor because they can't win elections. They're not winning elections when actually people get behind a curtain and get to vote by secret ballot and say, yeah, yes or no for unions. I mean, we do that for everything else. Well, I mean, notwithstanding the last year and a half, we do it for most important offices. We vote by secret ballot. But they don't like that. So they're going to try to impose this card check regime where you basically say, if I can convince you, John, or if I and two of my big neck friends can convince you to sign a card that says you're interested in the union, that counts as a vote for unionization. In fact, we have now
that's different than the current practice, though, right? Isn't it?
It would be, yes. The secret ballot election is the preferred and actually statutorily and from a precedential standpoint, the way that you select representation in the workplace.
And Ms. Abruzzo has said that they will recognize the card check method of determining whether or not somebody joins a union or whether or not they unionize a business. Is that right?
That's correct. They believe that no matter what happens and how those cards were obtained, they're going to basically see that as majority status.
Why should anybody be worried about that? Why should anybody care whether or not people, whether it's easier to unionize a business or more difficult?
Well, because most of the time, even the AFL-CIO admitted in an organizing handbook that you've got to get 75% of all the workers in a unit to sign these cards to have any chance of winning a secret ballot election, because they know that many workers will simply sign the card to get you off their back. When you show up at their front porch at 10 o'clock at night with three of your friends and say, hey, are you interested in higher pay, or are you interested in health insurance, or just sign the card, that coercion, that intimidation that's implicit in that type of organizing campaigns basically defeats the whole purpose of the secret ballot. And if they can get those cards as the mechanism for certifying unions, then the intimidation and coercion will only expand over workers.
On the eve of Labor Day, Mark Mix with the National Right to Work Foundation. Thank you for talking to us on One American News, sir. Good to catch up with you.
It's a privilege, John. Thanks for the opportunity.
On this Labor Day holiday, a roundtable conversation on the state of unions in this country. And joining us once again for a discussion about unions, Mark Mix is the president of the National Right to Work Legal Defense Foundation, and David Madland as well, joining us, a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress. He's the author of the recently released book, Reunion, How Bold Labor Reforms Can Repair, Revitalize, and Reunite the United States. In 1983, 18 million Americans were members of unions. At that time, 20% of the U.S. workforce. Again, that compares to 14 million today, 11% of the workforce. Your thoughts on just those raw numbers?
Well, John, I think one of the interesting facts about the union numbers is that we have more public sector union members in this country now than we have private sector union members. And so the growth for unions has been in government. And I think we've seen some results of that increased growth and power of union officials when it comes to government and government activities. You know, the idea that no one can join a union is just not correct. I mean, you know, one of these things that we talk about all the time is that somehow employers are just the worst type of employer and that they need to be unionized. Well, if we extrapolate the union membership based on public sector union members being the largest union in the country, then one can surmise that the most evil employer in America is government, because obviously they're at 37, 36% of the union density in the government sector. And most of that comes with kind of government privilege. They pass laws that say the union will be the monopoly representative of all workers in a workplace. And so the model for unions, what they ought to do is go back to what Samuel Gompers preached in his final speech at 1924 in El Paso, Texas, and adhere to the institution of voluntary unionism. He knew that when workers are coming together voluntarily, it's inherently stronger and better for workers than one that's cobbled together through compulsion that's articulated in federal law and state law.
We're going to be talking about some of the laws on the books, and some of the laws have been proposed that will impact union membership in this country. And as we have this conversation in this hour of the Washington Journal on this Labor Day, here's how we split up the phone lines. It's 202-748-8000 if you're a member of a union in this country. All others, 202-748-8001. Our guests again, Mark Mix of the National Right to Work Legal Defense Foundation and David Madland of the Center for American Progress. Mark Mix, explain what your organization is, what you do, and is your group anti-union?
No, John, we believe that every worker should have the right to join a union and be protected in that right. But we believe that no worker should be compelled to financially support a labor union which they disagree with for whatever reason, whether it be ideological or political, whatever it is. They should be able to choose whether or not they want to financially support a labor union. The Right to Work Foundation has been around since 1968. All we do is represent employees that have had their rights violated by forced unionism schemes. And so what we've done, we sue unions, we sue employers when they violate workers' rights. We try to help workers exercise their rights under the National Labor Relations Act under Section 7, the right to associate, the right to bargain, and also the right to refrain that's written into that law. So we've been around, again, since 1968. We have 21 staff attorneys, and we've been to the U.S. Supreme Court 18 times on behalf of workers. And every one of those cases have been defending an individual worker's rights in America's workplace.
What does it mean to be a right-to-work state?
A right-to-work state is a state of one of 27 states now that have passed a right-to-work law. It's very simple, John. Workers can decide for themselves whether or not to financially support a labor union. A worker cannot be fired in a right-to-work state because they decide that they want to keep the money in their pocket and not forward it to a labor union. That's it. That's the complexity of a right-to-work law.
The House back in March, on March the 9th, waiting for action in the Senate. If it were passed in the Senate and signed into law, Mark Mix, what would it do?
Well, it would eliminate the 27 right-to-work laws across the country that have been passed by state legislatures or by constitutional amendment or referendum. So the federal government would basically once again impose the compulsory unionism regime that was created during the Roosevelt years in 1935 and say that no state could free workers from being forced to pay dues or fees to get or keep a job. And so those 27 state right-to-work laws would be wiped out immediately upon Joe Biden signing the PRO Act, which he's promised to do. The other thing it would do, getting back to David's comments about penalties for an employer that punishes a worker for union organizing. I mean, Section 7 rights of the National Labor Relations Act and concerted protected activity are something that the NLRB takes pretty seriously. And while there may not be penalties for employers, there's certainly back pay for workers where the NLRB has adjudicated that the employer has violated their Section 7 rights. So the idea that there's no penalties is really not quite true. What they're talking about here is a $50,000 first-time fine and a $100,000 fine on small businesses across the country if there's allegations of an unfair labor practice charge. What they want to have happen is to have the employer completely out of the equation when it comes to unionization. And I think an employer and employees in that relationship ought to have conversations about what happens in a unionized situation. Nothing stops workers from trying to organize a worker. There is a process, organize a workplace. There's a process for that under the National Labor Relations Act. It's pretty rigid. Everyone knows what it is. The unions just can't get over the fact that they need to compel people. That's the problem. I mean, if you go back to the problem that unions have, it's because they're using government power to grow their ranks. And while David says that 60% of the people would like to join a union or participate, if you look at the polls when it talk about forced unionism, we know that over 8 out of 10 Americans believe it's wrong to force workers to pay a fee to a union for the right to work. And so even union households have that view. So the idea of voluntary unionism is one thing, forced unionism is completely another.
That's when elections end up having consequences, right?
Liz Schuler from Tuesday at the Christian Science Monitor Newsmakers Breakfast. Mark Mix on her comments.
Yeah, well, I'm kind of intrigued by it. You know, the idea that the PRO Act would pass would give union officials dramatic new powers over individual workers, like forcing them to pay dues or fees in order to keep a job in the 27 states that currently have right-to-work laws and wiping it out. Moving toward a regime where the secret ballot election gets pushed aside in favor of card check, which is a clearly coercive and intimidating way of getting individual workers to sign cards. Even the AFL-CIO knows that, you know, you got to get 75% of the workers in a unit to sign a card to even have a chance to win an election when they go behind the curtain and vote by secret ballot. You know, the coercive intimidation of card check is one of the things that we've helped workers with. It's been unbelievable, the stories that you hear from workers saying, you know, someone shows up on my porch at 10 o'clock at night, or a couple people show up on my porch. And most of the time, even the AFL-CIO admits that most times workers will just sign the card to get you off their back. So the card check part, the right to work part, the penalties for small business people, I mean, secondary boycotts. They're going to legalize secondary boycotts where union protesters and militants can protest customers of a targeted unionized company where they're trying to unionize their workers. So you can shut down the supply of flour to a bakery, if you will, in order to get the baker to say, yes, I'll agree to card check unionization or certification of a union or whatever it is the union wants to demand of him. So the provisions in the bill, and as David mentioned, you know, the idea of changing the definition of independent contractors, this is targeting Uber and Lyft drivers across the country who, you know, they want to unionize those people. They can't if they're independent contractors. The only way they can be unionized is they're employees. And so that's kind of the secret recipe behind the AB5 language, which was passed in California legislatively and actually reformed on a ballot initiative, Prop 22 in 2020. And unfortunately, just the other day, 2 weeks ago, I guess the California Supreme Court overturned the referendum, a popular vote by the people who said they wanted to reform the so-called gig economy eliminating legislation that California passed. So there's a lot in the PRO Act, and Liz Shuler talks about, you know, the work that people are out there going on the line. They're pushing, they're exercising their rights. But the one thing they want is more power to force more workers to join unions and pay dues or fees to get or keep a job.
A lot of union mix.
Yeah, great. Thanks, John. And thanks for the call and thanks for the question. I wanted to follow up on that issue anyway, because the idea of the duty of fair representation, which both of these callers have mentioned, that the union has control over all the negotiations in a contract, and a non-union member who might not pay dues or fees to keep their job benefits from that as well. Well, the history of that is pretty interesting, John. What happened in 1944 in a case called Steele versus Louisville Nashville Railroad, the union was recognized at that particular railroad, and the white union officials decided they didn't want to represent the black railway workers. And so that went up to the U.S. Supreme Court because the union had this exclusive bargaining power, saying they could speak for everybody in the bargaining unit and no one in the bargaining unit could speak to the employer without the union people present. So these white union officials discriminated against black railroad workers. And the Supreme Court looked at that case in this Steele case and said, you know, if you're going to have this exclusive bargaining privilege, if you're going to rely on this monopoly that you get in the workplace, then you have to represent every worker. You can't throw these black workers off the train, if you will, in that particular case. And so this duty of fair representation is something unions have never objected to. We have, to the caller in New York, we support legislation that says workers and union officials can only represent their members. In fact, nothing in federal law stops unions from representing their workers. Talk to Bill Gould, the former chairman of the National Labor Relations Board under Bill Clinton. He admitted that federal law allows union officials to negotiate contracts for members only. They can do that. But the one thing union officials demand after they're certified is a union security clause, which somebody mentioned a couple of calls ago. And it's exactly that. It's union security. It's not worker security. It says the union will be secure here and the employer will collect the dues and they will speak for every worker. And there's been a series of Supreme Court cases, Vaca v. Snipes in 1967, that said the unions control the grievance process. They can decide to take a grievance all the way to its completion, or they can say to an employee who happens to be a non-member saying, forget it. We're not going to grieve for you. All of this is legal because unions have this unbelievable monopoly power. If they would give that up, then there would be no problem. Then they could negotiate for their members only, which they can do under federal law already.
David Madden, over the course of that decade and today, the labor movement finds itself at its weakest position since the early 1930s. Mark Mix on that history.
Well, it speaks for itself, obviously, but I want to get back to the question of this democracy issue that David mentions. You know, we are a constitutional republic. We're not a democracy. And yet, while we use the democratic principles to solve some problems, there are certain things that should be untouched by democracy. The idea that you get one more vote than I do, that you can force me to pay dues to private organization is really wrong, if that's the way the law is. But, you know, there are some rights that should never be subject to an election. That's a quote from, I think, Associate Justice Robert Jackson of the U.S. Supreme Court. And when we talk about life, liberty, and the right to property, one's labor is property. And so the idea that We block someone from joining union, that's a problem. But forcing someone to pay dues and associate with a private organization is a violation of that individual freedom. This notion that somehow the government can impose a industry-wide agreement on everybody in a marketplace is another issue of this kind of one vote more. I have one more vote than you, so I can do this and I can impose my will on you. I mean, that shouldn't be in the American workplace when it comes to the individual's rights as it relates to property. The idea of force is something that we abhor in this country. We give government the ability to force on certain subjects. That's the one entity that we give the right of force to. No private organization should have that force. And the idea that union officials benefit everybody, there are lots of organizations around the country, lots of institutions, lots of studies, lots of non-government organizations that benefit all of us. But that doesn't mean we're forced to pay them because it benefits us. We accept that benefit, and if they do what we like, we give to them voluntarily. That's the essence of America. We don't donate to these causes that we believe in because they're doing good things. The idea of compelling someone to support them changes the dynamic completely. And so what's happened in America is union officials have relied on compulsion and force. That formula will not work. They'll continue to decline until they get back to the shop floor, working for American workers, representing them, not playing politics for their money. They're a $1.8 billion political industry just in the last 2 years, and a big portion of that money goes to one political party. And I would suggest to you, this may be a stretch, but there may be some union members out there that disagree with that political agenda, and especially those that are forced to pay for it as a condition of their employment in the 23 states that don't have right to work laws.
Mark Mix, you've got the final minute.
Yeah, there was a place for unions. There is a place for unions. There will be a place for unions in the American workplace, but there's no place for compulsion. There's no place for force. They need to go back and adhere to the institution of volunteers. They need to show the workers in America that they can do things they want to do and they can help them. But relying on government and relying on political elections and relying on political activities and literally spending billions of dollars on political activity is not the solution. I mean, the solution is to go out and convince workers to join them. The bottom line is people will vote for unions when they feel like they want to. They also will vote against them. We must protect the individual rights to decide for themselves whether or not to financially support a labor union. It's that simple. That's what Right to Work does. It's not anti-union. It's pro-worker, and it's pro-freedom.
Always an interesting conversation, especially on Labor Day with you two gentlemen. Mark Mix is president of the National Right to Work Legal Defense Foundation, NRTW.org. David Madlin, senior fellow at the Center for American Progress. His book, Reunion, How Bold Labor Reforms Can Repair, Revitalize, and Reunite the United States. Thank you both for your time this morning.
Thanks, John. Appreciate it. Thanks, David.
To the John DePietro Show. Folks, joining us right now, so appropriate with its Labor Day weekend, is our friend from the National Right to Work Foundation and its president, Mark Mix. Mark, it's John DePietro. Great to have you on again, and happy Labor Day.
Thank you, John. Happy Labor Day to you. We may be celebrating a different way than other people, but it's a celebration of the American worker, and that's appropriate.
Mark, take us through. There are some bills in the Senate that everyone should be concerned about.
Yeah, first and foremost is the so-called PRO Act, the Protecting the Right to Organize Act, which has already passed the House with no hearings and no testimony and is pending over in the Senate, that would first repeal all 27 right-to-work laws in the country, John. And these laws are really very simple. They protect a worker's right to keep their job if they decide they don't want to financially support a labor union. Those 27 states have done right well economically, and not only on an individual freedom front, but also from an economic standpoint. And I know lots of states up in the Northeast could use the economic numbers that Right to Work states are providing. You know, basically 5 times greater number of people employed, basically lost jobs in the manufacturing sector in the forced unions in states over the last decade, a 30% higher private sector growth in private sector employment. You know, the story is getting better and better all the time, John, that freedom works. And in those Right to Work states, that's where the economic vitality in the country is coming from. And so that bill would repeal those laws. It also would try to eliminate the secret ballot election for union certification. It would introduce secondary boycotts so unions could protest against customers of a targeted company for unionization, penalties for small business people, wipe out the independent contractor rules, think Uber and Lyft, and make them employees so they can be unionized. Shall I go on, John?
See, you know, that is exactly the type of thing. And this is also, since it is back to school, the teachers' unions have also been very busy.
Oh, my gosh. The president of the Los Angeles Teachers Union, Unified Los Angeles Teachers Union, did a rare interview with Los Angeles Magazine the other day, and the lead of the story is, you can recall the governor, you can recall the school board, but you can't recall me. That was the quote from the teacher union boss out in Los Angeles, who's basically held those children out of school, saying they've lost nothing, John. Don't worry. The fact that they're not in school, they've lost nothing. They've lost no opportunities. In fact, they have learned the definition of riot versus protest and words like insurrection and coup, and they've learned how to make self-sufficiency. They've learned those things by being out of school. This is a union official that holds her teachers out of classrooms and holds their children out of classrooms to fight for defunding the police, for millionaire taxes, for all these things that have really nothing to do with the educational system in Los Angeles. But that's no surprise. Union officials of the largest teacher unions across the country, like Randy Weingarten of the American Federation of Teachers, were basically involved in writing the regulations for the Center for Disease Control on how to open up schools again. I mean, and then interacting with the White House on that and basically overruling some of the recommendations that the CDC made. So, yeah, those teacher unions are pretty powerful, and we've gotten a really clear display of that over the last year or so.
Folks, we're speaking with Mark Mix, who is the president of Right to Work in the country. And Mark, under President Trump, I mean, I think we saw some gains, but it sounds like people should be paying attention that, you know, right now with the Biden administration, they certainly want to enable and make the labor unions far more powerful.
Yeah, John, and really that's not, I mean, you have to be a little more specific about what Biden's got in mind and what his administration has in mind. They're not talking about rank-and-file workers, because if they were talking about rank-and-file union workers, they wouldn't have put the pipe fitters and the operating engineers on the XL pipeline on the unemployment line, you know, shortly into the beginning of this administration. What they're talking about is giving radical union bosses dramatic more powers over individual workers across the country. I mean, when you talk about forcing someone to pay a union in order to work, that doesn't help the worker. That helps the union bosses. When you talk about eliminating the secret ballot election in favor of a card check, a coercive card check scheme, that doesn't help the worker. That helps the union official. When you talk about penalizing, small companies who are, barely making it over the last year and a half with allegations when there is allegations of an unfair labor practice charge to the tune of $50,000 or $100,000, that doesn't help the workers. That helps the union bosses. When you talk about boycotting a business that has nothing to do with unionization except for they're a customer of a targeted company, that doesn't help any workers at all. That hurts workers and helps union officials. So that's what Biden's up to. When he says he wants to promote unionism, he says he wants to promote forced unionism, and that's exactly what they're trying to do.
Folks, again, we're speaking with our friend Mark Mix, National Right to Work. And Mark, what are some other things that people should be thinking about on this Labor Day weekend?
Yeah, well, you should be thinking about your pocketbooks and the tax money, because the Biden administration is dead set on using the so-called infrastructure bill that's now passed, the $1.2 trillion infrastructure bill that has about anywhere from about 25 to maybe 35% of what we call hard infrastructure in it. The rest of it is kind of, regressive left engineering of our government. Then they need to worry about the $3.5 trillion budget reconciliation bill that's coming down the pipe that talks about, giving union officials the ability to make union dues a tax credit. That means that taxpayers across the country will be paying union dues for all union workers across the country. They're talking about, as I mentioned already, Uber and Lyft drivers being designated as employees for unionization, which will basically wipe out that model. I mean, these are things that government can, when they put their finger on the scale and they start, creating this crony capitalism, and it's hard to say it that way because they're actually empowering, self-admitted socialist union bosses. They're giving them more power over workers and more power over taxpayers. And by golly, they'll spend whatever it takes to make good on Joe Biden's promise that he's going to promote unionism. He said it 3 times, so I said it 3 times. But what he really means is promote forced unionism.
Now, Mark, what are some of the other things that over the next few months that everyone should be watching as far as coming out of Washington?
Yeah, well, obviously the budget reconciliation bill, the $3.5 trillion, and then the idea of basically trying to change the Senate rules is another story that keeps popping up. That because they can't get the radical regressive agenda passed, they need to break the filibuster, change the Senate rules, and make the Senate a simple majoritarian body. this is a structure that has basically allowed Congress to be at least deliberative in passing or considering, radical pieces of legislation. So we got to keep our eye on that, and obviously they're very close. And then, of course, the courts. You have to look now. We've got the new news about the Supreme Court, and the anger's been piqued again, and so we'll probably hear about court packing, which is another bad idea. The last time they tried that was in 1935, and that's when we got our federal policy, federal labor policy, pushed through by Roosevelt over the original adjudication of it by the Supreme Court as unconstitutional. But he threatened to pack the court. The court basically switched their votes. Two of the justices switched their votes, and now we have a federal labor policy that takes the rights away from states, which the Constitution said shouldn't ever really happen, especially in areas outside of those specifically enumerated by the Constitution.
Folks, again, he is Mark Mix, National Right to Work. Mark, great job as always. I will wish you a happy Labor Day.
As America is getting back to work, some of that government stimulus supposedly is supposed to end today. So we'll see what happens if the labor market numbers show a definitive increase. You would think that it would. Mark Mix joins us. He's the president of the National Right to Work Committee. Hey, Mark, how you doing? Happy Labor Day to you.
Thanks, Bill. Happy Labor Day to you. I'm doing fine. How are you?
Well, hey, I'm doing terrific. I just made it back to the mainland from Hawaii last night. I'm here in Los Angeles, and so it's been an interesting trip. And I love it when I'm traveling because it gives me a chance to, talk to people, from all over the country and to get, kind of connected with their pulse as to what's going on, particularly what we were experiencing in Hawaii. The people are, there's not aloha, let's just say, there's a little dampening there. I mean, you've got the governor of the state telling people don't come, and we've got the lieutenant governor saying, look, if we get 95% of the people to wear masks, that will cure COVID. I'm not sure what science that comes from, but hey, that's their story. They're sticking to it. But here we are, and it's. Hawaii is open for business, but it's a little bit of a process. And I just want to warn people that the typical aloha spirit is not quite there yet. They're working on it.
Well, Bill, there's lots of news, obviously, and that story is a big one, and following what's going on with travel and all that kind of thing. I'm still trying to fly domestically and getting around, and the airports are filling up, and things seem to be coming back, but I know there's lots of issues regarding that, too. But today's a good day to talk about labor unions if you want to do that.
Yeah, let's do that. Big unions and big government, you say, are having the time of their lives under this president.
Yeah, indeed. This president has talked about, he said he's going to promote unionism. He said it 3 times, so I'll say it 3 times. But what he's really promoting, Bill, is forced unionism. I mean, the idea that workers can freely and voluntarily choose to associate with unions is something that is protected in federal law. But yet this administration is pledging to go farther. And one of the main things they're doing is trying to pass a bill called the so-called PRO Act, which has already passed the House, is on its way to the Senate. It passed there with no hearings, no testimony, that would repeal the 27 right to work laws across the country, which simply say it's a worker's choice whether or not they want to join or financially support a labor union. They can't be fired from their job if they do that. Unfortunately, in California, if you don't pay union dues or fees and you're in the private sector, you can be fired from your job. And that's right. Wrong. That's un-American.
Yeah. Yeah, without a doubt. And again, the Democrats are doing everything they can to ensure the election, that they get reelected. And they've been able to utilize the force and influence of union. And, and of course, Joe Biden had to make up a little bit of work with the unions because of what he did with the XL pipeline. The union wasn't real happy about that.
Yeah, indeed. That was kind of interesting. He talked about defending good-paying union jobs, and then the first week of his administration, he signs an executive order that puts a bunch of pipe fitters and operating engineers, all union jobs, on the unemployment line. There's a disconnect there, and then you go and you approve the so-called Nord Stream 2 pipeline in Russia that allows them to expand their oil and gas industry, and yet it shrinks it and forces it out here in the United States, and those union jobs are gone. They're not coming back.
Exactly. Well, and Mark, this is the thing that's crazy. I mean, how does he I don't know. Maybe because the unions figure that, they've been voting Democrat. It's been such a tradition for so long that they don't know any better. They're not seeing the adversarial effects that this administration has placed upon them and their livelihood. I mean, and the thing is amazing to me is when Joe Biden during the campaign talked about how his father was left hanging and out of a job and how tough it was, for him and his family to deal with that. And yet he goes ahead and, does it single-handedly. Like you said, in the first week of his administration. And you're thinking, well, what did I miss here? I mean, he said that he understood because of what happened to his dad. And then he goes ahead and does it himself to, workers, and union labor force, which is amazing, especially after all they did to get him elected.
Yeah, indeed. And one of the things that we need to talk about here, and it doesn't get talked about a whole lot, is that we just assume that when we say union, we mean that there's cohesion and agreement by the rank-and-file workers and the union officials back here in Washington, D.C., or in Sacramento, California, for that matter. Mm-hmm. The bottom line is this, that the gap, the ideological gap between rank-and-file workers and union officials is growing wider and wider and wider. And Sacramento is a great example of that, but it's even a better example now in Washington, D.C., because when Joe Biden talks about unions, he's talking about the top bosses of the big unions here in Washington. Mm-hmm. And you're right, yes. Bill. They spent about $1.4 to $1.8 billion on politics and lobbying in the last 2 years. And a big chunk of that money was spent supporting candidates and ideas that many rank-and-file, blue-collar, private sector workers across the country disagree with, without a doubt.
Well, and this is why they've been, going to the courts and saying, to go back to what you said earlier, and that is that it's one thing to participate in a union because, to protect your interests and your job interests. But when you start being forced to, use your dues to support a candidate that is antithetical to your own values, that's when the rub comes in and you're hearing more and more conflict on it. But, the union and the Democratic Party being what it is, they're about forcing you they'll compel you. You have got to do that. If not, like you said, in some cases, particularly here in California, you'll lose your job, which is, it's amazing that this is happening in a free America.
Yeah, indeed it is. It's the antithesis of what we believe that we're supposed to be protecting here in the United States. In this grand experiment in self-government, individual freedom and individual rights is a cornerstone of our experiment in self-government. Unfortunately, we've given special powers to a private organization, i.e. a labor union, going all the way back to the 1930s, where the federal government steps in, puts their thumb on the scale, and says this private organization can literally demand that an employer fire you if you don't support them financially. And I know there's a lot of arguments around this, but when you get to the nub of it, Bill, when you cut it down to the core, it's forced association, it's forced speech, and those are violations of the First Amendment clearly and, unapologetically.
Yeah, the compromise is freedom. I mean, if we're a country, a land of the free, home of the brave, how does that support that ideal? And anything that's in our Constitution is antithetical to it. And this is why well-meaning people, and they get frustrated, and so they choose no longer, to be in the union. But we saw what happened. I mean, at one point, Mark, I believe the unions represented about, 35% of the U.S. labor force. And now, outside of government, I think we're down to less than 10%. But what's been a boon for them and allowed them to survive is they just, they saw the writing on the wall and realized that they weren't going to be all that relevant on the private sector. So they moved into the public and they started buying politicians. I mean, this is what allows them to live, does it not?
Yeah, indeed. I often refer to the public sector as the final frontier for organized labor. They have, that is the one place where apparently there is this ever refilling pot of money. In the private sector, it has real implications on the way businesses operate and the way the economy operates. But in the public sector, they found the kind of the oil jar that can never quite gets empty.
Right.
And unfortunately, folks in California and folks in New Jersey and Illinois and New York and other Connecticut, other big union-controlled states on the government side are, if it hadn't been for the COVID relief bill, there would be very little left in the oil jar, frankly, for them. But you're right. That's their final frontier. They are about 6% of the private sector workforce. They're about 35% of the public sector workforce. But the good news, Bill, is that we argued a case at the U.S. Supreme Court back in June of 2018, a case called Janus v. AFSCME, and the Supreme Court there, like you, agreed that forcing someone to pay dues or fees to work is a violation of their First Amendment rights. Now, this is only for public sector workers, but every government worker in America is now protected against the forced payment of fees to work for government. We have what I think we could call correctly a national right to work law for all government employees, but there's still more work to be done, that's for sure.
He's the president of the National Right to Work Committee. Mark Mix is with us, and our conversation with him will continue. Stay with us. We're coming on just about 18 minutes before the top of the hour. Welcome back. 14 minutes before the top of the hour. Bill Martinez here. It's Labor Day 2021. We're talking with Mark Mix, the president of National Right to Work Legal Defense Foundation. And Mark, let's take a minute here and assess the state of the union when it comes to labor on this Labor Day.
Yeah, Bill. Union officials keep talking about how somehow their ability to attract workers is a problem and it needs to be fixed by government. The bottom line is this. Union officials going back to the 1930s with the passage of the federal labor policy that governs private sector labor management relations in the country is founded on the idea of force and compulsion. And they have government privilege to say, you can't work if you don't pay me. That's not a secret for success. I mean, there's no incentive for them to provide services, to focus on the workplace, to focus on the worker, and provide real benefits that someone would want to buy voluntarily. If they would focus on the shop floor instead of the political shop floor, if you will, I think they'd be a whole lot more successful. And that's a recipe for success, not for a decline as they're seeing.
When you look at it, if it was relevant, and it was positive and win-win for the labor force, you would see an increase, not a decrease. And they've only aligned themselves with an institution that is quite telling that big government protects unions and this mindset, which is debilitating. And I believe, in my humble opinion, having been in business most of my life, Mark, and which makes me sad, is that you're taking the U.S. labor force and all its human potential and you're reducing it to mediocrity. This is what I have seen in my experience in my years with what's happened in the union. And I saw this raise its head recently. I don't know if you caught this or not, but it's the same kind of mindset that gives you the response that the general told, was it a general for the UK, you guys, you got to stop working so hard. You're making us look bad, when they were extricating their nationals out of Afghanistan. And that kind of mindset is something that I've seen consistently work on the union floor, is that, hey, you're making us look bad. Why are you working so hard?
Yeah, that's exactly right. The exclusive monopoly control that union officials exercise in the American workplace, it helps to punish the most aggressive and the most eager workers, and it helps to protect the most, unproductive workers in the workplace. And that's not a recipe for success. And you're right. We represent a lot of employees whose first encounter with the union was, look, pay up or be fired, pay up or lose your job, pay up or who knows what else will happen to you. But the one thing that we do hear a lot is exactly that, this idea of taking away the best, hurting the worst, or helping the worst, hurting the best, and making everyone medium is not a recipe for success anywhere, frankly.
Exactly. I mean, when it comes down to it, and there's been repeated studies on this, boy, I guess the most significant thing that can happen for some in terms of their happiness is to have a job, to be productive, to be able to exercise the giftings and talents that God has blessed them with. And when I have seen that in operation, I see businesses that thrive, the people thrive, they're there for a long time. It keeps things humming along. But when you have institutions that want to limit people and say, well, okay, there's a ceiling here, and you're not going to go any higher than this, and you're encouraged to throttle it back, Well, that's tedious, and it's not very rewarding, but you would think that they would get a grip of it. But, when you've got a government that supports this, is it any wonder the bureaucracy is so compromised? And when you look at it and you go, in all fairness, tell me where the government is shining in any of these bureaucracies. I mean, right now, all the three-letter agencies, it would appear, are, rankly corrupt. And beyond that is that, they can't account for money. I mean, forget it even about the military. The military, they haven't done an audit on the military. And here we left billions of dollars in Afghanistan. And, and this is all indicative of a bureaucracy that's so bloated and unaccountable.
Yeah, that's right. And that accountability is a real important function in any place that you're operating, whether it be a workplace, a labor union, a radio show, whatever it is. You've got to attract people by being good at what you do, and there has to be accountability for those above you. And the union officials, take the United Auto Workers Union. 12 of their top executives, 2 of their former past presidents are in jail today because they could not be held accountable by rank-and-file workers. I mean, they were stealing money from the rank-and-file workers, and workers in 23 states are forced to pay the fines for the bad behavior of these union officials. But the business model, Bill, is really one that, if you could get it, I guess it would be pretty rewarding. I mean, basically, everyone has to listen to your radio show, whether you're on the air or not. They have to tune in, right? Or no matter what you talk about, they have to tune in. That would be good for you, but not good for the radio industry or for the folks that are forced to listen, that's for sure.
Yeah, exactly. And the other thing, too, and I think that people understand when things are, when they're contrived. It's not very rewarding, whether you're a show host or, you may be able to play the game and all that kind of deal. But it's like, wow, and I don't care what level. I mean, you could be at the highest level of union operation. And when you are managing mediocrity, I don't see how that provides any kind of excellence for your leadership, does it? Or am I being too philosophical?
No, I think you're being spot on. The fact is, these stories occur every day, all day long across the country. Those are the good news stories that we never get to hear about. Unfortunately, when we hear about the idea that some private organization's been given the privilege to compel people to pay them to work, that's what we need to be talking about. The vision that you have and the vision you articulate about, giving a person an ability to step up and work hard and achieve things, that's the story of ordinary Americans. It's only when the government gets involved. When government gets involved and interferes with that, as we have trouble, and that's where we are in labor policy, is the Sacramento bureaucracy applying it in California and the Washington, D.C. bureaucracy applying it across the nation with policies that don't encourage people to be their best, that don't encourage people, to be their own kind of bosses, if you will. And that's ultimately what we are, Bill. We're our own boss. Isn't that right?
Well, without a doubt, that's the way I was raised. That's the way my father raised me, and I was fortunate to be around mentors that reinforced the same thing. Self-responsibility, hard work, and for me, I've been blessed in following that formula, and I share that with my kids, and that hopefully they'll share that with their kids, because I believe that that's a proven formula for success, especially if we're, allowed to, continue with this free America. I get it that it's, under attack because there's been antithetical forces coming against this free America forever. But, the thing that we have on our side here, Mark, is that we've enjoyed freedom. We've paid the price for it. We've gone to wars. We've sided with people who are interested in in liberty, and we continue to do it. And we've had a taste of that, and more than a taste, that's part of our tradition. And so I'm hopeful that it cannot be wiped out. That people will once again realize that they've been sold a bill of goods. And when you look at what's happening in California, oh yeah, that's right, we got a recall underway there. New York lost a governor. All these things are hopefully, people will pause for a moment and really analyze as to what's going on. I mean, the beauty of this, federalist government is that we have all these laboratories. We have 50 laboratories in operation, and we need to be able to take a look at these different operations and say, look at what's working. Why is it that, a place like Florida operates more efficiently than Baltimore, for example. What is going on? And you can say consistently, these are Democratic strongholds that hold the people down, whether it's in Illinois or, we're talking now Portland and other areas in Baltimore and that, D.C., all this stuff. I mean, it's like, okay, but the people there, see, this is what I grieve over, Mark, is that, again, I am one to fight for human potential and people's God-given gifts that, are just aching to be expressed. If we give them an opportunity to do so, gosh, I think, a lot could be healed. And even regardless of this $3.5 trillion boondoggle that we're, being forced to swallow here, I believe that we can even overcome that.
Yeah, indeed, Bill. Freedom rests on choice, and where choice is denied, freedom is destroyed. And those are the simple questions and the simple imperatives of who we are as Americans. And when we protect freedom and we expand freedom, we expand opportunity. And when a government bureaucracy says it's one size fits all and everybody should do this or everybody should do that, and we should have a federal policy that mandates terms and conditions of employment on businesses across the country, those things are designed to take away that initiative, to take away that incentive. I know it sounds grandiose, but that's how America was made, and that's how America will survive and how it will prosper. And we need to remember that as we move forward.
Mm-hmm. Well, it may sound grandiose, but it's practical, isn't it? I mean, we have practical experience to support this. I mean, it's not like you and I are at a bar and we're, on our third round of drinks here, trying to influence one another. I mean, we've got a long history of how liberty works and how it blesses everybody, and not only people in this country, but people around the world. America has a heart to serve, and we've done that continually. We always run to the fires. We run to national disasters, and we're there to help out these causes that happen. And that's the heart. That's the blessing of America, is that we've been greatly blessed, and we want to bless others.
Indeed, Bill. And it is 12 o'clock here, but I know it's not 12 o'clock out there, so be careful with that first round, okay? Let alone the third round of drinks. My goodness. Yeah,
I know. Yeah. Surely I exaggerate. Mark Mix, president of the National Right to Work Committee. Mark, thank you so much for coming on. Happy Labor Day to you and the 2.8 million member public policy members that are involved in the organization. And give them a website they can go to find out more information.
Yeah, they can find out about us at nrtw.org, nrtw.org.
A politician has two ends, a thinking end and a sitting end. Yeah, that's going to get us somewhere. Once again, here's the Valley's longest reigning talk show host, Fred Holland.
Mark Mix, old friend of the show, happens to be president of the National Right to Work Committee and president of the National Right to Work Legal Defense Foundation. Here on this Labor Day, Mark, we got the PRO Act hanging out there, and I think the Republicans should be very mindful. This thing has gone through the House, right? It said, and we don't know what's going to happen to it in the Senate. The Republicans took the dangerous track of depending on the courts to deal with Obamacare, and it didn't work out that way. This could be just as disastrous, couldn't it?
Yeah, absolutely, Fred. It's really literally a smorgasbord of everything that union officials have desired since the imposition of the National Labor Relations Act back in 1935. If they didn't get it in 1935, they're trying to get it in 2021. And the bill is a real masterpiece. And as you said, it's already passed the House of Representatives with no committee hearings, no testimony, just absolutely Nancy Pelosi saying, you know what, we're going to bring this up today and we're going to send it over to the Senate. And that's what they did. The bill is made up of, first and foremost, the repeal of all 27 right to work laws across the country. And Alabama and other states across the nation have basically taken the privilege granted them by the federal government by passing right to work, which is very simple. You get to decide whether or not a labor union gets your money. And you can work whatever decision you make, whether you decide to give them your money or you don't in a right to work state, you can continue working. Imagine that. But it goes farther. The bill also would begin to move away from secret ballot elections toward card check unionization, which is something that union officials have desired because they rarely win elections anymore when they have them. And if they say their win record is like 60%, but that's because they pull out of all the elections they know they're going to lose before they actually have the votes cast to keep those numbers up and pad their statistics. They're going to implement secondary boycotts, which have been statutory illegal. That means we get to protest the customers of a target that we are after for unionization. Meaning, if you're a baker, they can shut down the flour maker and use that leverage to get you to agree to unionization of your employees. That's illegal almost everywhere in the world, and yet they're trying to implement that here. And then the gig economy is going to be destroyed. They're going to make Uber and Lyft drivers employees so they can be subject to, guess what, Brad? Unionization. You can't unionize independent employees, independent contractors in the country right now, but if the PRO Act passes, then we've got a whole new class of employees that have chosen to turn their machines on and turn their machines off when they're working and choose when they're going to work, and they will be subject to unionization. So there's a lot there, and there's more, but I'll leave it at that. That's enough, I think, isn't it?
So obviously the desire here is, look, I was sadly in my early life, I was involved in a union situation, and it turned out that, I came out on the short end. It didn't help me very much. And the guy that they were trying to unionize, it just made things worse for them. But in any case, this never really, it soon dawned on me that a lot of people at the bottom end of this thing are pawns, right? I mean, this is really, look at the situation in other states or at the federal level where you have this incredible power in the union leadership. But it turns out they don't care particularly for the worker. It's basically just it's if you hate the 1% now, and I keep saying which 1% do you want ruling you? In the case of labor, that 1% is going to take nice vacations and live in big houses, and you may or may not have a job, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Every element of the so-called PRO Act gives union officials more power over rank and file workers. And to your point about them taking nice vacations, if you just look at the story that came out of Detroit, Michigan, in the United Auto Workers Union, that have been into Alabama several times trying to organize automotive plants down there, they've got 12 executives, 2 of their past presidents, that are either in jail or on their way to jail for spending $400 on bottles of champagne and $60,000 on cigars and villas in Palm Springs and kickbacks to their foundations across the country. I mean, the corruption goes with the compulsion. And you're right, they live pretty high on the hog, but the rank and file workers, and especially, in this administration, you have the, quote, most pro-union president in the history of the country in power. And the first thing he does is put operating engineers and welders and linemen out of work on the Keystone Pipeline that were all, guess what, Fred? Union jobs. So, yeah, there's something to be said about the disconnect between union officials and rank and file workers in this country. And you're exactly right with your premise there.
It's interesting because they highly endorsed the president, and then he turned around and fired them. They could not connect the dots, which is amazing to me, frankly.
Yeah, it's so sad. It is laughable because it's so sad. I mean, these rank and file workers, their money was used to elect Joe Biden, who literally within the first week of his presidency put them on the unemployment line. So
what went wrong? I want to go to something, down in Birmingham, they had the big the big election down there at Amazon. This was from what I can tell, I wasn't there, I read about it, pretty much a knockdown drag out with big labor trying to unionize these people. And not only did big labor lose, they were pounded, right?
Oh my gosh, yeah. This was an international campaign to unionize some piece of Amazon to get back at Jeff Bezos and allegedly the unfair labor practices that they were implementing at these facilities across the country. And the president made a video about it. Some international union officials came in and said this is a must-win for the unions. And I think at the end of the day, Fred, out of the entire unit, I think the unit was like 5,200 workers. I think they ended up getting maybe 14% of the workers that were eligible to vote for unionization. And I think they got 24% of the workers that actually voted to say yes to unionization after this international campaign that include Hollywood celebrities, the President of the United States, and all these intellectual pundits that show up when issues like this come up. The workers in Bessemer, Alabama said no. And when they started interviewing some of these employees, some of these people that had been in unions before, they said, look, they're treating us fine. And now this NLRB under the National Labor Relations Board under President Biden is actually looking at the election again because there was obviously nefarious activity by the employers. That's the only way that they could have won so overwhelmingly if they somehow rigged the election. And I think the one claim that the union makes is that it was a mail ballot election, so the workers had to mail their ballots in. I think Amazon put a mailbox out in front of the facility so that it would make it easier for workers to vote. And unfortunately, making it easier for workers to submit their mail ballots is somehow an unfair labor practice charge and unjustified under the Act. So we'll see. That story may not be over, but you're right. You're right. They voted overwhelmingly against unionization.
I look at you of anybody knows the history, of the labor movement in America. Look, this is not to say there weren't unfair labor practices. I've read stories about, we don't do child labor anymore. Not here. Apparently it's okay in China. And we'll even buy those products. But we've eliminated safety. I mean, there have been reasons over time for some kind of union organizing in areas where safety was a factor or underage workers was a factor. I mean, there has been a benefit, but I guess like anything else, it's kind of like some people in the civil rights movement. If you don't have a bad guy, you kind of lose your job, right? and we've reached a point where unions aren't as necessary in a lot of cases now because people are so well informed. Right?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. Now, obviously the argument always goes, well, there was a place for unions, and I agree. And I believe there's a place for unions today, and I believe there's a place for unions in the future under the circumstances that you just articulated. But there's no place for compulsion. And that, unfortunately, is the one ingredient in the unionization model that poisons the whole product, that poisons the whole well, if you will. Let me just quote Samuel Gompers. He was known as the father of the American labor movement. In his final speech in El Paso, Texas in 1924, in front of the delegates of the AFL, he said this. He said, "I want to urge devotion to the fundamentals of human liberty, the principles of voluntarism. No lasting gain has ever come from compulsion. If we seek to force, we but tear apart that which united is invincible." And the reason why Gompers had to give that speech was because the delegates of the AFL were thinking about going to Washington to have government grant them power. Well, unfortunately, Gompers got overruled, and the delegates went, and they got the Railway Labor Act in 1926, and then they got the National Labor Relations Act in 1935, and that legislation had the power of compulsion. Union officials became political animals as opposed to a business enterprise that went out and said, hey, here's what we can do for you. Why don't you join us voluntarily? They went to government for these privileges, and that's why they've got to play politics the way they do, Fred, because they are wards of the state. Their power is a derivative of government action. So where's the action for the AFL-CIO? It's in Washington, D.C. It's in Montgomery, Alabama. It's in Sacramento, California. But it sure ain't on the shop floor, and that's their problem.
So what do you think this thing's prospects? And look, Joe Manchin has already apparently derailed the big budget bill, or they got the infrastructure bill, but this other one looks like it's not going to make it. This $3.5 trillion thing. It looks like he's not going to go along. And there's some other Democrats that apparently in I think Sinema in Arizona is one of those. This sounds to me like perhaps people that may be hopefully against this PRO Act, because if it does get passed, where do we go from here?
Yeah. Well, that's an interesting question, and there's obviously legal implications for it that will obviously exhaust if it ever did get passed. But really, what the game is changing the Senate rules. They don't have the votes, and I think there are a lot of politicians that are actually happy that the filibuster exists, because as long as the filibuster exists, they can posture and they can beat their chest about how unfair things are, but they won't have a chance to implement policy. It's like the Green New Deal. I mean, you can be the greatest serious advocate for the so-called Green New Deal, but until they do away with the filibuster, a lot of the elements of that are not going to be implemented. And Joe Manchin's a perfect example of that. I mean, if they break the filibuster and they can pass the so-called Green New Deal with a majority vote in the Senate, then the coal industry in West Virginia are decimated. No question about it. So on one hand, you have the politics, the internal politics of the Senate rules that protects a lot of politicians who, shall I say, and try to be fragile with this, that don't really have a whole lot of courage to stand up and say, yeah, I'm willing to bet my political life on an issue like this. When it comes to right to work, I think the people of Alabama spoke pretty clearly. They put it in their constitution with something like an 80% vote down there a couple years back. Unfortunately, that constitutional protection doesn't mean much because the right to work privilege is a privilege granted by the federal government. And so if the PRO Act passes, notwithstanding the fact that the right to work protections are in the Alabama Constitution, they will not stand. They will be preempted by federal law. So, guys like Manchin, but the problem is there's Republicans on the other side that get pretty weak-kneed from time to time, and you never know what they're going to do. So, yeah. The only thing we can do, Fred, is keep the pressure on them. Just keep the pressure and remind them again and again and again that we're watching. And that's the only way we get to hold politicians accountable. The more they do in secret, the more damage they do. The more we make shine the sunlight on their actions, the better chance we have of defending against things like this.
So, look, I keep on this particular issue, and I don't want to belittle it, saying that this couldn't happen, but there are tons of silver linings here. I mean, you got a governor of Colorado who just happens to be a Democrat, but he seems to be a business guy, and seems to be in favor of not tinkering too much. You also have members of the Senate in some of these states where it is right to work, and I don't think they want to cut their own throats. I hope. Right.
That's exactly right. But Manchin's from a right-to-work state. Kristen Sinema's from a right-to-work state. Mark Kelly's from a right-to-work state. Raphael Warnock, who's up for election coming November. Not this November, but next November, from Georgia, he's in a right-to-work state. So yeah, those are the kind of the thought. That's the thought process that politicians go through. I mean, because we know this, Fred, and this is a question. This will be on the test. What's the first thing a politician thinks about after getting elected?
Themselves.
How to get reelected. Yeah, I think the answer is I'm going to my judge to see if that's going to work. I won't buzz you out because that answer works. They think about themselves, but getting reelected is the first thing they think about. And notwithstanding, there have been very few people that have ever come to Washington that haven't calculated like that. There are a few, and don't get me wrong, there are a few that have done that, and we need more of those types of folks. But generally, with the power that these people have and kind of the sycophantic support they get once they get inside the Beltway and get protected here, I mean, it's a pretty good deal, and they like it, and they don't want to lose it. And so politics plays into all that. But to your point, that's how we hold them accountable, and that's what this is all about. I mean, it was Madison or Jefferson. I think it was Jefferson. Maybe both of them said it, that the only way we can protect our form of government is to have educated people, meaning we know what they're doing. And this is how we get there. Your show, we get there telling them about it. We're talking about it now. This will play, on this day that's been designated by President Joe Biden in a resolution just moment, I think back on Friday that said, we got to praise union officials about Labor Day. Well, I think we should celebrate the American worker, 94% who are not in unions. I think they're just as they should be honored just the same. So it's good that we do that.
Let's keep the politicians out of this. I'm reminded by the Chad Mitchell Trio song about, a politician has two ends, a thinking end and a sitting end. And they really care about both of those. Let's celebrate the worker and try to keep government out of this because, look, you're worth it, right? As a worker, advocate for yourselves, right? You can do that.
That's right. All right. And notwithstanding the acronym of the PRO Act, there's nothing that stops people from joining unions in American law. So that's the truth of it, and that's what we should be celebrating on Labor Day.
Hey, I'm glad you made the point that you're not anti-union. You're just anti being forced to join a union, right?
That's right, Fred. That's simple.
Mark Mix, who is president of the National Right to Work Committee and president of the National Right to Work Legal Defense Foundation on this Labor Day. Hey, if people want to catch up with you, find out more about what you do, where do they go?
They can find us on that amazing internet at nrtw.org, nrtw.org.
Sane solutions for an insane world. Fred Holland.
Labor Day, ladies and gentlemen. There's a time where we celebrate typically the end of summer, but it actually has another meaning. So we thought we'd bring on the president of the National Right to Work Committee. His name is Mark Mix. Welcome back, Mark. How are you, my friend?
I'm doing fine, Simon. Happy Labor Day to you.
Indeed. Now, let's talk about this National Right to Work Committee. 2.8 million members. I don't think people have an idea how big this is. You're also, of course, president of the National Right to Work Legal Defense Foundation as well. But you got 2.8 million members.
Yeah, those are the people that have actually interacted with us. They've indicated they support right to work. They've supported us financially, or they've supported us through grassroots mobilization over the last couple of years. And yeah, it's not surprising. We know that at least 8 out of 10 of every American believe that it's wrong to force a worker to pay dues or fees to a union to get or keep a job. And so while we have a lot of activists, we also have a lot of support out there just on the principle alone.
Right, and when I talk about unions, sometimes people from the left side of the aisle say, "Oh, you just hate unions," and nothing could be further from the truth. Not only was I a member of the union, I was actually in charge of my local branch for a while as well, back in the land of my birth, in the National Union of Journalists back in the day. So I'm not anti-union at all, but I'm also not not pro forcing people, which is the key part, to pay for a union that they don't wish to belong to.
That's exactly right, Simon, and that's all the right to work law does. Whether you're looking at the right to work law that's been in place in Iowa for 60 or 70 years, or the laws that are in place in the 26 other right to work states, or the bill that we've introduced in the United States Congress, both in the House and the Senate, that literally, Simon, is a one-page bill. Now, I know that's refreshing after these 2,700-page infrastructure bills that you have to read to know what's in them, but a one-page bill that does not add a single word to federal law. It simply goes into the National Labor Relations Act, which was passed in the 1930s under the Roosevelt administration, and it says the bias in the law will be in favor of, get this, voluntarism as opposed to compulsion.
Wow. How crazy is that, man? Now, look, there's a lot going on under this president and indeed under Nancy Pelosi. There's a lot going on. They're under pressure on all kinds of fronts, right? But it looks like they're still trying to find time to do stuff that will essentially change Iowa's right to work laws via federal fiat.
Yeah, that's exactly right. There's a bill that's already passed the House of Representatives. It's in the Senate. It's currently pending in the Senate, but it was passed in the House with no hearings, no testimony. It was simply a bill that was rammed through back in March of this year that the president has said he will gladly sign and aggressively sign if it gets to his desk, that would repeal all 27 right-to-work laws in the country, including Iowa's. And, you wonder, Simon, how in the world can the federal government repeal a state law? Well, that's because the federal government's way too powerful, and they give privileges to states now. They don't exercise or respect states' rights. They basically say, here are the privileges that we grant you, and, if we just change our minds, we'll take them back. And the right-to-work law is one of those privileges that was granted by Congress back in the 1930s, and they can take it back, and they have a bill to do just that.
It's amazing. So could I be forced to join a union?
Well, you really can't be forced to join formally, Simon.
Well,
and, union officials always say that.
Yes.
There you go. There's a case, 1963, the U.S. Supreme Court said that, the original labor policy that said you had to formally join a private organization was probably a bridge too far when it comes to basic associational rights. But they hedged a little bit. They said, well, you don't have to join the union, but you can be forced to pay up to 100% of dues to get or keep your job. And then on top of that, what they said was, and how the unions enforce that is they say, well, if you decide not to join us, even though we can still force you to pay dues, you can't participate in any union activities. You can't play in any reindeer games. You can't vote on who the union leaders are. Or you can't vote on the contract that governs your employment. You can't go to the union hall and drink the beer. But you still can be forced to pay 100% of your dues to keep your job. So it's a Hobson's choice in many instances for workers. Do I protect my ideological and political rights, or do I give up my workplace rights? That's a choice that no worker should have to make, frankly.
Absolutely. I mean, this is nuts, right? People don't understand the power that the federal government still has. If this law were to pass, one assumes that fairly quickly you would find the states, the 27 states, I believe it is, would sue the federal government. You're a lawyer. Would they win?
Actually, I'm not a lawyer. We have 21 lawyers on staff, and so we have way more than enough, Simon. That's a great question. You know, they had this test back in the 1930s when Franklin Roosevelt came into office. He passed what was called the National Industrial Recovery Act, which is very similar to what we have as far as federal policy today, and it was ruled unconstitutional under Ninth Amendment, 10th Amendment decision-making at the court. Well, he then threatened to pack the court. In 1935, I believe it was, there was a Judicial Procedure and Reform Act that was in, and it said that we're going to raise the number of Supreme Court justices to 15. Now, I know this sounds like a repeat and a refrain because we're hearing it again today.
Sure. But
then the Chief Justice Charles Evan Hughes and Associate Justice Owen Roberts switched their votes when it came to saying whether or not the new National Labor Relations Act that Roosevelt just basically put in again, they switched their votes, they teamed up with the Three Musketeers, and on a 5-4 vote in the U.S. Supreme Court, they upheld the National Labor Relations Act as constitutional. And of course, the Judicial Procedures and Reform Act went away shortly thereafter, but the country has suffered going all the way back to 1935 with this unique and amazing power that the federal government has imposed on the states when it comes to private sector labor relations.
And of course, big unions, big labor, they've got a massive political war chest, don't they?
Yeah, absolutely, Simon. And, you know, we just released a study. We have a sister organization that released a study that documents just on the files and the records that they report to the government. We recognize $1.8 billion on politics and lobbying alone just in 2 years. $1.8 billion. That's pretty big money. I mean, for politics, it's not big money for government anymore, but it's pretty big money for politics.
There's so many things that we need to keep our eye on, which is luckily we have you because you're doing it for us. There's this getting out of your union dues thing. They're trying to make that quite literally a few days every few years that you'll have the opportunity to stop paying union dues. Literally a few days every few years. If you don't fall in that window, well, you're going to have to keep paying them for another few years. Have I got that right?
You do, Simon, and unfortunately, this is called the escape window period, and literally, it's an escape. You have to figure out how to escape from the union in order to protect your own money, protect your ideology, protect your philosophy, to protect your political rights, and that basically, the majority of the debate over that right now is over a Supreme Court case we won in 2018. We argued a case called Janus v. AFSCME, which was a case on behalf of a government employee in Illinois. And basically, we made the case in that argument at the U.S. Supreme Court that this was a violation of the First Amendment right of this employee, and that everything that government unions do is political in nature because they're redressing government. They're basically, in Des Moines, they're telling legislators what they have to spend, how they have to spend their money. They're intimately involved in government policy, and the Supreme Court agreed with us. And they said that no government worker can be forced to pay dues or fees to keep their job anymore in government. That's the public sector. What states did, like New Jersey, is immediately upon thinking that was going to pass, that the Supreme Court was going to uphold the First Amendment rights of government workers, and God forbid, they did it. They actually did it. But New Jersey got out ahead of it, and they put up a 10-day window period that if you don't get out and thread that needle just perfectly, Simon, you're stuck in the union for another year at least. We have a case right now pending at the Supreme Court on behalf of 2 teachers in New Jersey that are contesting that unbelievably burdensome window to get out and exercise your First Amendment rights in the Constitution.
I mean, that's really horrific. It genuinely is. It's like, we're going to trap you. We are going to raid your wallet, whether you like it or not. That's fundamentally what this is.
That's absolutely right. And what union officials are saying by addressing and endorsing policies like this, they're saying basically if we give workers a choice, if we allow them to make decisions for themselves, it's possible, perhaps likely, that many of them would decide not to associate with us. So the only way to fix that problem is to create legislation that forces them to associate with the union, forces them to pay dues in the private pay dues. Forbid, they did it. They actually did it. But New Jersey got out ahead of it, and they put up a 10-day window period that if you don't get out and thread that needle just perfectly, Simon, you're stuck in the union for another year at least. We have a case right now pending at the Supreme Court on behalf of 2 teachers in New Jersey that are contesting that unbelievably burdensome window to get out and exercise your First Amendment rights in the Constitution.
I mean, that's really horrific. It genuinely is. It's like, we're going to trap you. We are going to raid your wallet, whether you like it or not. That's fundamentally what this is.
That's absolutely right. And what union officials are saying by addressing and endorsing policies like this, they're saying basically, if we give workers a choice, if we allow them to make decisions for themselves, it's possible, perhaps likely, that many of them would decide not to associate with us. So the only way to fix that problem is to create legislation that forces them to associate with the union, forces them to pay dues in the private sector, and then create unbelievable obstacles for workers to exercise their rights under a First Amendment Supreme Court decision from 2018. The only way they can keep people from leaving is to build the wall. This is like the Berlin Wall of America. You build a wall to keep people in, not to let people out, to keep people in.
Crazy. And this is going on in Chicago as well as New Jersey, right?
Indeed, we have a case on behalf of 2 teachers there who are basically experiencing the same problem. They decided to cross the picket line when the union called the entire educational structure in Chicago out on strike. They wanted to teach their children. They got penalized and they got, intimidated, and they tried to withdraw their union dues as a condition of their employment in Chicago, because Chicago's not a right-to-work state, and the union out there doesn't recognize the Janus decision, so they intimidated these employees. They are part of the litigation at the U.S. Supreme Court as we speak as well.
And what do we call it when a union or union officials spend, $2.5 million on a candidate for governor in, say, Virginia, after they have changed their opinion of right to work? What do we call
Simon,
that?
I would defer to your wonderful accent and your articulation. Why don't you pick something to call it, and I'll agree or disagree. How about that?
I would call that curious.
That's a good word.
It's curious.
Yeah.
Yeah. Mark Mix, if people want to find out more about you and your organization, where do they go?
Simon, they can find us on that amazing internet at nrtw.org. nrtw.org.
There you go. That's simple. Mark Mix, it's always a pleasure having you on the show. Thank you very much for joining us today. I really do appreciate it. And you and I am sure, will talk soon, sir.
Thank you, Simon. Appreciate you bringing this up on Labor Day. Happy Labor Day to you.
Hey, Steve, this is Mark Mix from National Right to Work. Hey,
Mark.
Sorry I missed you.
Yeah.
Apologize about that.
No worries. It happens. Appreciate you calling back, though. And I'm looking forward to talking to you about this as we're coming into Labor Day weekend. There are obviously a lot of Labor Day celebrations that we see every year. And this year, I guess the labor unions have a lot to celebrate, don't they? They've got some really good friends now in high positions.
They absolutely do, Steve. And President Biden just released a resolution, honoring folks that work on Labor Day and saying that everything that is sustainable in this country was created by labor unions. And I think 94% of the private sector workers in the country that are not part of the union, even though they'd like, maybe some of them would like to be, would have some argument with that.
Yeah.
But, this president's about empowering union officials, not rank and file workers. And all of the policies that he's implemented in his last 8 months have been designed to do just that.
Well, he's got to pay back his supporters. I mean, if they're going to throw millions upon millions of dollars into his elections and into his campaign, well, then there's a they want something in return for that, obviously.
Yeah, actually, it's amazing when you think about the money that they poured in. It's not even really millions and millions. And I know even now, billions doesn't seem like much, Steve, with all of the money that's being thrown around in Washington. We're into the trillions now. And what comes next, by the way? Is it quadrillion? I think it's quadrillion. I think we better prepare for that, so we should know that.
We're going to get there
well-informed radio hosts like you. Well-informed radio hosts, you should know that. But, we put out a study that showed that union officials across the country spent in the last 2 years, just in the last 2-year election cycle, up to $1.8 billion on politics and lobbying. So, yeah, they've got a big debt to repay, but they did get a decent payoff with Joe Biden in the White House and Chuck Schumer running the Senate and Nancy Pelosi in the House of Representatives.
What's amazing to me, and I was thinking about this morning when they were talking about the abortion bill in Texas and the reaction to it by Nancy Pelosi, and I don't want to get into the details of it, but this idea that once these people are elected to office in Washington, D.C., that they can make rules for the rest of the country. This whole idea of federalism seems to be lost on these people. They think they have the unique power to tell 330 million people how to live their lives simply because they got elected to office in their one little district.
Yeah, and that's right. And, there was a conversation about that back in, 1787, 1788, about what role the federal government was going to play in the lives of Americans. And obviously, they have not only expanded the bubble of federal control, but they have blown out the bubble of federal control and control basically everything. And labor policy is a great example, Steve. I mean, we have a federal labor policy that imposes forced unionisms on the states. Connecticut and the 22 other states that don't have right to work laws don't have a statute that say a worker loses their job if they don't pay union dues or fees. That authorization for union officials to have you fired comes from, guess what? Federal law that was imposed. And frankly, Roosevelt, when this law was passed in the 1930s, he knew, because when they first introduced the National Industrial Recovery Act, the Supreme Court said, no, the federal government can't do that. You can't impose this on the states. Well, Roosevelt wasn't one to give up, and you never let a good crisis go to waste. We've heard that before in numerous situations. Well, he just re-teed the bill up. He threatened the Supreme Court by threatening to pack it to 15 members, and two of the justices, the Chief Justice and Associate Judge, switched their votes, and now we have a federal labor policy that's imposed on the entire country. And interestingly enough, from our perspective on this Labor Day, as we look back and think about right to work laws, that was a privilege granted by the federal government. Get this. This is like, an edict comes out from the kingdom out to outside the fence or outside the moat and says, oh, by the way, we're going to grant you the ability to say that workers can't be fired if they choose not to support financially a labor union. So you're right. The federal Leviathan is alive and big and growing, and Lord knows we're going to have to get ready for quadrillion, Steve.
Without a doubt. I didn't properly introduce my guest here. This is Mark Mix. He's the president of the National Right to Work Committee, and he also serves as the president of the National Right to Work Legal Defense Foundation. So the man knows of what he is speaking. And one of the things that's happening right now is this PRO Act legislation that's being pushed. It actually passed the House and is pending in the U.S. Senate, that is just amazing in its scope and in what it does. Wiping out the 27 right to work laws just at the federal level that these states have, which I think, again, as you just talked about, is a complete overreach of federal powers over the states. But so many other little things in here that just wouldn't seem to be problematic, except they truly are. And one of them that jumped out at me was this idea that they want to force unionization of freelance workers like Uber drivers. I mean, yeah,
Steve, this is interesting. Yeah, you got it. I mean, the so-called AB5 language that basically bloomed out in California because Uber drivers and Lyft drivers and other gig economy workers, which is a growing part of our economy, no question about that, where workers basically say, here's what I'm doing. If you'd like to buy some of it, you can do that, but I'm not going to be an employee because I do other things. And, those employees, and you won't be surprised by this, Steve, hold on, independent contractors can't be unionized. You can only unionize employees. And so we've got to make them employees so that the unions can get a crack at forcing them to pay dues to increase the union coffers. And that's in the bill. And so you're right to be alarmed about these types of federal encroachments on, when you decide you want to turn on your meter in your car or your computer or your phone in the car and then turn it off when you want to and work on Monday and Wednesday and Friday as opposed to Monday through Friday or you want to work at 11 o'clock at night as opposed to 8 o'clock in the morning, they're going to take away that and make you an employee based on some kind of control over an algorithm, if you will.
And we've seen this big push in places like California to make these people employees as opposed to independent contractors. And it never occurred to me that this was the next step in that process. So if the first step is to have them considered employees, which means now that Uber has to provide health insurance and all these other things, now it's becoming really clear what the push was for, especially in places like California. And that's to give the unions more membership, meaning more power.
That's right. And actually, there's already legislation on the books in Sacramento that would do just that. In fact, we ended up representing dozens of Uber drivers up in Seattle when the Seattle City Council passed an ordinance that said in order to be an Uber driver or a Lyft driver, you had to be a Teamster union member and you had to let the Teamsters represent you. We actually represented those employees up there. The case actually, interestingly enough and surprisingly, died in the Ninth Circuit on an antitrust argument, but it was pretty clear back then, this was a couple of years back, that this was the game. dream, and this was the vision. And frankly, Steve, as you know, these regressive leftists, they have long views and long set goals, and most of the time, regular Americans are just trying to do their job, take care of their family, and they don't want to play politics. They have to when they want to, or when they have to, they do, but they kind of go back to their own lives. But these regressive leftists are about changing our country, and they're always engaged, and there's a long vision for all of this. And it's pretty clear when you see bills that would, for example, take away your right to vote for unionization by secret ballot and force you to just sign a card when 3 union officials show up on your porch at 10 o'clock at night and say, hey, sign the card. Union officials even admit that people sign those cards just to get the union officials off their front porch or off their back. And yet that's going to be the way that workers are going to be forced into these forced associations that, unions basically want to spread across the entire country. And it's not about the American worker. American workers have a free choice to decide whether or not they want to support a union. In fact, any worker right now could join the AFL-CIO and pay them money and give them their paycheck and do all of that if they wanted to. The question is, will you be forced? And this PRO Act is about forcing workers into unions and empowering union officials and giving them more power over America's workers.
Which, just flies in the face of the basis for this country. We were not meant to have a country run this way, where you've given these unelected officials, especially, the power to force people to do things against their will. But again, they believe, I think, that this is the way the country should run, and they have a very friendly administration and leaders in both houses of Congress that they're going to take advantage of that while they can. One of the other problems I have, one of the things that I find rather humorous about these gig workers getting hosed here is many of these gig workers are people who write columns or independently write for different newspapers and magazines and other publications. And a lot of those people were promoting and supporting this effort to have them be considered employees until it actually happened. And then they found out, well, okay, if the publishers said, okay, if anything more than whatever 6 or 8, whatever the number was, I don't know what it was, columns, you are considered an employee. And so they stopped hiring or buying these columns from these people after that number. And these people are now going, wait a second, this is my living. I can't sell. Yeah, guess what? Unintended consequences, huh?
Yeah, absolutely. And interesting enough, Steve, to complete the story on that, all of those people that were put out of work decided that they were going to try to put amendments to the so-called AB5 bill on the ballot. And they did that in November of 2020. And the people of California, get this, the people of California actually overturned many of the provisions of AB5. But just 2 weeks ago, the California State Supreme Court overruled the result of the referendum for some really obscure reason, saying that the opinion of the public is not necessary here. We're going to decide to follow through on your threat of these elitists sitting up here and saying, sit down, shut up. This is what's good for you. They overturned the amendments. Well, the PRO Act didn't even bother with the amendments. They have the original AB5 language in it. But to your point, it was interesting that those that were crying out the loudest about having this thing implemented were the ones that were crying out the loudest when they couldn't make money anymore for the work that they wanted to do.
Yeah, well, it's like the very people who, again, I don't want to get into the politics of it, but when they implemented the Affordable Care Act, they changed the definition of a full-time worker, and lo and behold, a lot of companies cut people's hours, and people were really angry about that, and they were getting angry at the business owner, and it was like, no, don't get angry at the business owner, folks. Get angry at the rules that they put in place, because people are going to figure out ways to work within the rules, and generally, you're going to get hurt. So I just find it always kind of ironic when the very people who promote these sort of things end up getting hurt by them without even realizing why and where that came from. There's a couple of other issues that are happening here too, and it's the National Labor Relations Board. That's another thing that I don't even know why that exists, but under different administrations, it tends to move back and forth regarding some of their rulings. And now under a very friendly Biden administration, we're seeing it being taken over by some very, very, very pro-labor union people, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right, Steve. And it's actually not even really pro-labor. It's pro-forced unionism. That's the key. Because, the idea of unionism is something, if it's voluntary, then, we shouldn't have a problem with that. In fact, today, President Biden honors some of the old labor leaders of the country, and he mentions Samuel Gompers' name. Samuel Gompers is kind of the grandfather of American unionism. And Samuel Gompers, in his final speech in El Paso, Texas, to the AFL delegates in 1924, said this. He said, "I want to urge devotion to the fundamentals of human liberty, the principles of voluntarism. No lasting gain has ever come from compulsion. If we seek to force, we but tear apart that which, united, is invincible." So basically, Gompers was telling people, don't force workers to join us. Go out and sell your product to them, and they will be inherently stronger. But yet, the American labor movement today and the leaders, the big bosses of the union movements, are all about federal legislation to impose more forced unionism on Americans. And you're so right. I mean, these people the NLRB is the implementer of that. This National Labor Relations Board is a 5-member board that adjudicates the federal labor policy that's been cast over the entire country back in the 1930s. It was 3, now it's 5. And you're right. Biden had to fire the top lawyer at that agency 23 minutes into his administration because that top lawyer during the Trump years was actually doing something that was really nefarious. He was unbelievably considering employee rights when it's supposed to be a battle between big business and big labor. And God forbid we can't have anyone thinking about the employee in place so important. Yeah.
No, we have union bosses to enrich. One of the things that I find really kind of just disheartening too is nobody's calling the president out for some of these things. Your organization is, and talking about how he basically just violated his own ethics pledge by putting former union officials on the NLRB. I mean, in what world does nobody call this guy out for this kind of stuff?
Yeah, see, what is that cliche that we're using way too often now? Rules for thee, but not for me.
Yeah, exactly.
Is that an appropriate answer to your question? Yeah. Look, this guy has got one day, and I'm not even sure he really knows what's going on at that level, but he knows he's got people around him that understand that this is a time to take power, and this is a time to expand power. And he doesn't care how he does it, whether he breaks the ethics rules. I mean, you have a general counsel of the National Labor Relations Board who came from being the general counsel of the Communication Workers of America, one of the more radical unions in the country. And when asked about whether or not she was going to recuse herself about any cases that might be dealing with her previous employer, the Communication Workers of America, maybe. I don't think so. I think this is fine. And then there's two new board members on the 5-member board that is now controlled by by Biden appointees that were basically general counsel, one a general counsel and one an acting general counsel for the SEIU, which is one of the most radical unions in the country. And they're going to be sitting there adjudicating cases on behalf of union officials that will go against not only businesses, but will go against employees. And we know that a big bulk of our cases at the Right to Work Foundation are at the National Labor Relations Board. We're probably one of the largest litigators there on behalf of individual employees against unions and against big business. And boy, oh boy, the environment has changed because Biden doesn't care much about his rules. They don't apply to him or his people.
Final thought, Mark. I want to talk to you just briefly about this Janus ruling and how the unions are doing everything they can to sort of bypass it, or in the cases of like here in Connecticut, just ignore it entirely, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Janus was a case we won at the U.S. Supreme Court back in 2018 that basically said that every government employee in America had a First Amendment right. They couldn't be compelled to pay dues to a government union in order to keep their jobs, because everything government unions do is, guess what? Politics and lobbying. So you can't be forced to speak. Well, what they've done, and we have actually 2 cases pending at the U.S. Supreme Court now, one in New Jersey where teachers have objected to what is a 10-day window period, that if you miss it, Steve, by 30 seconds on either side, and if you don't do it just right by showing up at the union hall, providing your driver's license or social security number, and you miss it, you're locked in for another year. And that's happened in a couple of states. We've got 2 teachers from Chicago that we're representing that we're heading to the U.S. Supreme Court with, and we hope the court will hear it, because basically what the unions are doing, to your point, are flouting the decision of the United States Supreme Court back in 2018 that says, look, not only do you have a First Amendment right, but you have to tell someone, you have to affirmatively say that you're willing to support the union. That hasn't happened in many states across the country, and we're going to continue to fight to fix that.
Well, that's why I appreciate having you on, and that's why I appreciate the efforts of your organization, because the fact that they can just ignore Supreme Court rulings shows you just how much power the unions have here in this country. And it takes an organization like yours to push back. And hopefully the Supreme Court will see it your way, and we'll be able to get these rules enforced. And unfortunately, it looks like you're in for a bit of a couple of tough years here, though, under this administration.
Indeed. We've been through these before. I've been doing this for 35 years, and there's good years and there's bad years. The Bible tells us to harvest when it's good and to store up when it's not, and that's what we'll do. So, Steve, thanks for the opportunity. I'm sorry I was late today. I apologize about that. Thanks for reaching out to us on this to talk about this important issue.
Yeah, no, and thank you very much for calling in, and I appreciate the conversation, and thanks for your efforts. Mr. Mark Mix, where can people learn more about the National Right to Work Committee?
They can find us at on that amazing internet at nrtw.org.
Fantastic, Mark. Keep up the good work, and we'll look forward to having you back.
Thanks, Steve.
Take care.